I'm talking about it even though we're not going to do it. That's okay. And I'm talking about it and I'm not pressuring you. Or we're talking about it and there isn't an expectation. Like, I think sometimes we have to name that. Sometimes we have this story that, like, if we're talking about it, then it has to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then I'm going to let you down. And then we're going to have conflict. So we'd rather not talk about it. And like, that becomes this story that fuels it, as opposed to, hey, I know that we're not having sex tonight. Like, I know that this is not happening. And I still want to, like, hear how you're feeling. I still want us to be able to prioritize talking about this for a minute, or what, like, to just name it and have it be in our mouths, so that it's not something that the other person or both people feel like is not being honored.
I'm Olivia Clementine, and this is Love and Liberation. Today, our guest is Vienna Pharaon. Vienna is a licensed marriage and family therapist and owner of Mindful Marriage and Family Therapy. She is one of the most sought-after therapists in New York City. She has a way of leading people back home, connecting deeply to their needs, and helping people connect to their voices in order to create the change they wish to see in themselves and in their relationships. She blends the art and science of the work beautifully and helps couples find their path forward. We're in a world of 7.5 billion people, and yet so many of us settle in love. Why is it that we settle, and even if our heart has a knowing, we kind of go against it and then just kind of do something less than?
Yeah, we sort of override it, accept something that's in front of us. And, I think it's a topic that I talk to a lot of my clients about. And I think especially from women, if they are interested in family planning, a lot of times there's a big part that feels sort of under the pressure to accept something that is sort of good enough, so that they can fulfill on the vision and like the story that they've wanted for themselves in terms of having a family. So a lot of times, people will settle in that space, or women will settle in that space because they want to, quote unquote, accomplish sort of the next stages of life. And there's a big threat, right? If they have to end a relationship that is dysfunctional or like toxic for them, that what happens if I end it and then I have to go back out into this dating world, which most people feel negatively about, right? They think, oh gosh, dating apps, or how am I going to meet somebody? And it just feels so chaotic and messy. And especially if they have friends who are sharing their horror stories of dating, it just becomes overwhelming to think about going back out there, meeting someone who's going to be like a high quality human being, like dating them, partnering with them for a little while, then potentially getting engaged or getting married. And then, you start counting up the years, or counting backwards, as many people do, who are like, okay, I have this many years to do this. So, and then it's going to take a year to get married and a year to be engaged. And, these are all of the structures and systems that our world has put in place. And so we don't actually need, all of that. But I think a lot of times it becomes a big threat response of like, I can't accomplish all of that. I can't do all of that. And so I'm going to stay where I am because it's the easiest path forward to, achieving what it is that I want to achieve within, the family system and relational system, kind of fantasy and vision.
What do we do if we're in that position and we feel, we know that, or whether we're single, right? And we don't actually have somebody in our life, but yet we feel the push, like we have to rush, or we're in a relationship that's not right. I know this is a big question, right? And it's going to be many different shades depending on the person's situation, but what can we even do, like in our mind and in our perspective?
Yeah, I mean, what happens is many people start choosing from a disempowered place instead of choosing from an empowered place. And so fears and threat responses tend to be what leads the show. And so we get really afraid of, I'm going to be alone, or this is never going to happen for me, or it's going to take too long, or I'm going to miss my opportunity to potentially have a child, or who's going to want me if I'm older than X, fill in the blank. And interestingly, everybody has a different range of what X is that they think is too old. And no one's going to want to be with me if I hit this, or I don't make enough money, or I can't provide, or, whatever the story might be. And so, what do we do about this, I think is the question. And you're right, there are many different segments to this, but I think one of the most important things is, how do I move myself into an empowered place? How do I start to choose from an empowered position, even if things are a little intimidating and scary for me? It's like, what does it look like to be grounded and centered and to feel confident in my choosing? And how do I stay committed to that, even when there might be certain things that feel really threatening about it? I've heard people say, it's so, like, especially women, I've heard say, it's so unfair. Like, obviously there are opportunities to, freeze our eggs if you're interested in having a child. And people will sort of like lash out at that and be like, but it's ridiculous that, like, we have to spend so much money in order to remain in an empowered position where we're not having our fears or these threats, be in the driver's seat. And so, if we don't go down that path, we're talking about a lot of dysfunction in the systems that are in place. And I don't know that we necessarily want to go down that path today. But I think if there is at least a start point, it's, what does it look like for me to be choosing from an empowered position? And what would shift and change if I was choosing from this grounded space of what actually aligns for me? And where in my life am I choosing from a fear-based place, from a threatened place, from a chaotic and frantic place, because I am just looking for or needing a specific outcome? And to just reflect on that and see where it is you are residing.
Like, we could really get into that, like how do we even know if we're living from a fear-based place, right, versus this more empowered place? Is there some indicators for somebody?
Yeah, I think oftentimes when we're more attached to an outcome than we are the process, I think if we use language like, I need this to happen, or I'm not going to be okay if this doesn't happen, those types of, like, that type of language often is rooted in chaotic energy. We feel very unsafe and insecure in that space. And so I just need to be partnered. I just need to get married. I just need to have a child. If I don't do this, then I'll never have this chance. There's a lot of absolute language that can often creep into that space for the disempowered place.
From a practical point of view, how can one be engaged in their life and a part of their life, but also not controlling it? So kind of just leading on from what you're sharing right now, like, what does that look like for someone to be an active participant, but yet not manipulating, right? And not like grasping.
Yeah, I mean, I think that to become an observer of the self is such an incredible tool to have in your toolkit. And that requires us to pause and to slow down and to sort of quiet our surroundings. And so, for some people that's through meditation. For others, it's sitting on a park bench somewhere. For another, it might be photographing. For someone else, it might be in their workout experience, where they get to quiet that space and observe themselves and observe their reactions and observe their responses, so that they are connected to what their experience is. And I obviously, as a therapist, I am a big believer in therapy as an incredible space for people to reflect and actually have another person who is also observing them sort of challenge and ask some of the questions that they might not ask themselves. But yeah, I mean, I think to be an active participant in one's life requires us to be observant of ourselves and to see how it is that, like, what our trends are when we try to disconnect from ourselves or from others, or I think you said, like, how do we stop ourselves from becoming manipulative in that space? And were you asking, like, that, what's the tie for you when you think about being present and also worrying about being manipulative? I'm just curious.
Being a human being, and especially in this world of like create your reality, in some
Uh-huh.
ways you want to like really be a part of every moment of your life, but at the same time that can become so limiting, right? Because all we know is what we know. So how can
Right.
we open up to something greater? And I think in the realm of relationship, whether we're in long-term relationship and we're kind of dealing with the day-to-day of like wanting something different or just like wanting to be a part of it versus allowing life to exist and to
Yeah, it's a
be as
great
big
point.
as it wants to be and love to be as big as it wants to be. So I guess
Yeah.
that's kind of the tie of the two, of like how do you
Yeah,
play with both.
totally. I mean, I think so. It's then also allowing other people to teach you. I think you're right. We have a limited belief system. Most of our beliefs are based on what's been programmed. And, many of us, and probably many of your listeners, have challenged their belief systems and do some work to dive into that space. But I have always found that being around other people and allowing them to give feedback, or being a true listener and learning about the experiences of others who are different than you, is a beautiful way to begin to challenge that belief system, so that you're not just creating a life that continues to be an extension of what your programming is, right? And it's not to say that all of our programming is bad. It's not, right? But that there's certainly things that we need to challenge and expand in order to be as connected and present to both ourselves and what is around us.
I love that. It's just the
Mm.
being a true listener is like the way we can really open up to being both creators and also surrenderers.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we don't do well generally as humans is to listen to understand instead of listening to respond. I think I've said this before in other podcasts, or I've written about it, and I believe that many of us are listening, and we're already coming up with our defense, or what it is that we're going to say next, or how we're going to disprove what the other person is doing. And this can be both in our intimate relationships, or this can be on like topics about gender or race, or whatever it might be. And so how do we begin to actually pause and allow someone else to teach us something that we don't know, and to stop telling ourselves that we have to protect ourselves or defend ourselves in these conversations where it's always a threat response, right? It's like, I have to protect and tell you why you're wrong, or defend that I am not doing X, Y, or Z. And when we can actually be grounded in that space and allow someone to teach us and allow someone to speak and share and open us up and expand ourselves, like I do think that that's where so much of this connection to self without it being manipulative can happen.
So good. Yeah, I feel such relief hearing you say that. And it brings me to feel so tied into the holidays. So many of us grapple with how to relate to the holidays, and that seems like it would be a really good support system. Like, how can we listen more than needing to know? Because there's so much tension, right, in our families sometimes, or the pressure of the new year, all these things. And listening is such a peaceful gift to our
Yeah.
heart. Just hearing you share, I feel much more peace in my heart.
Oh, good.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to talk about was self-worth, which I just a topic I really love, because I think, what blocks so many of us from love is our lack of self-worth and our lack of feeling like we deserve love. Kind of coming back to the first part of our conversation. And I'd love to just get down and dirty, I guess, with like, how do we support our self-worth and like really shift our mind around really, and our being, our physiology around really recognizing that we deserve love.
I think a really good start point is looking for all of the evidence that tells us why we're not worthy. A lot of times people want sort of the 5-step plan to create self-worth, and it's like, follow these 5 things. And on the other side, you are going to feel worthy. It's like a good Cosmo article. And I don't think it really works that way. I think that the start point is, how am I proving to myself day in and day out that I'm not worthy, right? If I'm struggling with self-worth, what I know that is true, what I know that I am doing is that I am proving to myself that I am unworthy or that I am unlovable day in and day out, in maybe quiet moments and also loud moments. And why? Right. And so a lot of the work as a marriage and family therapist, a lot of the work is understanding the family system in which we grew up. It's looking at really important relationships in our lives that really stand out to us, and to look at the stories that support this narrative that questions our self-worth, that questions our ability to truly believe that we are lovable. As Brené Brown says, right, it's our birthright, right? It is our birthright to be deserving of love, to belong, to deserve love. And I think many people can sort of conceptualize that and agree with it. It's like, okay, you're born into the world, like you deserve to be loved, you deserve to belong. And so we sort of get that on a high level, but when we actually have to drop it down into our own experience, we don't know where the intersection is, right? And somewhere in our story, it's like, well, everybody else, I often ask people, do you believe that anybody else is just undeserving of love, right? That they're not worthy of it? And most people say, like, no, of course not. It's like, would you tell your friend that? Would you tell a stranger that? And no, it's like, and so somehow we have this belief that we're the only one, like everybody else can have it. Of course, everybody else is deserving of it. But I'm not. And so, okay, like, why am I the one person, in this world, or of people I am close to, who is undeserving of love? What supports that? And so going back to what I was saying before, it's very important to explore your family system. It's very important to explore how you grew up. It's important to understand how your experiences either support or don't support self-worth, and whether you're lovable. Because a lot of times our doubt starts to build out from a very early age, or it starts to build out from our first romantic relationships. And so when we can go back into that space and begin to explore our experiences that support a lack of worthiness or a lack of being loved, then we can start to unpack that and repackage it in a way that is actually empowering and serves us. It's very hard when we have experiences in our childhood where we don't feel prioritized, or where we don't feel chosen, or where we don't feel listened to or understood, where love is conditional, where love gets withdrawn, where love is given when a parent is sober, but not when they're in their addiction. Where we have trauma, where we have dysfunction in seeing our caretakers or parents in their own relationships, and then we get caught up in it because we're the children. Those are things that affect us and our narrative about whether or not love is for us. And it's very hard for many of us to believe that another human being is going to love us or choose us if we have parents who maybe weren't great at that, right? And it's very hard to believe, like, if my mother couldn't do it, how can I believe that somebody else is going to, right? If these people who are really supposed to, I hate using the word supposed to, but I think it's appropriate here, right? It's the job of a parent to do that, to guide and to love and to nourish and to nurture. And when that's not there consistently enough, right, it's very hard for us to believe that some other human just met that they're going to be able to. And so, that's not something that everybody necessarily feels, or that's in each person's story. But I would ask your listeners to consider where in their lives there is evidence of not being loved, or not being chosen, or not feeling worthy enough, right? Like, where are the experiences that set that that script in motion in the first place? And where did that get re-triggered? Where did that get supported? Because we generally have a pretty good account of data and evidence that supports our story, right? Enough so that we believe it. That's generally how it works, right? So part of it is going back into that account to look at all of those experiences and see how much emphasis we put on it, what the story is that we tell ourselves about that, and then how we can start to integrate that into our adult lives now so that we're not living again from that disempowered place that leaves us feeling threatened or insecure or unsure about our future. And that brings us back, I think, to your original question of, why do we settle, or how do we settle, and why do we tell ourselves that something is enough when we know in our heart or in our intuition that it isn't? So we did a roundabout there, but hopefully that gives a start point.
Yeah, that's so helpful. So do you find with your clients, when you break down their family history and the stories that they've grown up with, and they're able to actively replace them with a new story, and then that enables them to feel more worthy of the kind of love that they want?
Yeah, it's certainly not as simple. It's like that is sort of in its skeletal position. Yes, like something like that. But it takes a lot. You think about how many decades we have of telling ourselves a really similar story, and how many decades of, unfortunately, we do a lot of confirmation bias, right? We recreate patterns, we choose people who are going to confirm the story that we already hold. Which it's all intertwined, right? Is why we surround ourselves with other people who can be observers of us and who can teach us, so that we don't constantly confirm the bias that we have, especially when the bias is something that leaves us in a disempowered place and leaves us disconnected and stuck in our suffering. So yes, it is, in its skeletal form, it is about exploring our past. It is about exploring its impact, how that past has impacted us and has generated a story. It's about looking at that story and seeing whether or not that story services us or doesn't. And then it becomes how we can start to integrate that in a way that actually is authentic, that actually has enough stick to it, so that it doesn't sway when something familiar comes around again, right? That's part of the process, is here it is again. And, is what I'm about to do or say or choose an extension of my old story or my new story? How do I ground in this space? And there's a lot of back and forth. It's usually not, oh, here it is, and now I know how to integrate it. But yes, through practice, through observing yourself in that space, through having other people observe you in that space, we can begin to integrate that, and we can start to write a new story. But we also have to look to see why it is we're resistant to writing a new story, right? We all say oh, this is who I want, or this is what I want it to look like, or this is what I want my life to be. And then we resist it. And why, right? And there can be many answers to the why. One that I think is an important one to explore is how confronting it is to realize that maybe I have been lying to myself for a really long time. And that's been a really interesting one that has come up for many of my clients, right? It's why do I resist a new story that I say that I want? Well, how do I feel about myself when I realize that I have been telling myself something that has been untrue, or has been something that has left me in suffering for a really long time? And I don't know that I want to confront that. Right. And so sometimes the path is easier to just go with the wind, to just go with what I know, to just go with the confirmation bias, to just stay in my story. And so that's, it's certainly not for everyone, but it's something to consider.
In gratitude to our listeners, and to support the making of this podcast, we want to let you know that you receive 10% off our shop of online courses and botanical delights. We grow, gather, and formulate a beautiful and effective collection of herbal teas, herbal tonic powders, skincare, and a line of tinctures. We also have an online course called The In-Between, to support anyone moving through heartbreak or who wants to move towards a future partnership from wholeness, self-awareness, and love. Visit oliviaclementine.com and at checkout enter the code LOVE and LIBERATION for a discount on both the botanical offerings and courses. Thank you again for your support. Now back to our conversation. So I know we definitely have listeners that have children and have been in long-term relationships, and I definitely have clients that listen to this podcast that really struggle with keeping intimacy alive, and also just how to keep their intimate relationship deeply connected. It becomes less of a priority, and oftentimes one will be a little more exhausted, less interested in intimacy. And I'd love to hear your point of view of both, if there is one, like what you see in terms of the natural evolution of intimacy and long-term partnership, as well as ways that a couple can enliven their connection.
Yeah, I mean, so certainly there is a reality of, what happens after birth to the body, and how it needs to recover. And so there are some realistic things that are definitely going on there. And then obviously a huge transition of time and energy and exhaustion and new roles and expectations, both sometimes being met and sometimes not being met, covert expectations, these expectations that we think that we have agreements on, but we actually haven't said out loud that are getting missed. So there's a lot that is changing in that space. That is very real. On top of that, though, I think that there is a very significant story that our society has generated that I'm not sure really works in the favor of couples, and that's the story that intimacy goes down. It goes away. Once you get married, you've heard it before, right? Once you get married, once you have kids, say goodbye to your sex life, or say goodbye to this. And that's not a fair story, right there. And that's why I started with the reality of it is like, of course, things change. And, especially in the early parts of having children, whether it's your first time or it's you're a repeat customer, there is a lot that is asked of you that is different than, hey, we just get to prioritize each other whenever we want to, and we can go do this, that is not the reality of it. But to allow ourselves to just go with the story that this is something that just goes away. And, as you get older, forget about it. Like, your sex life is going to go down. It's going to decrease. If you have sex once a month, like, congratulations, or once a year, like, you're doing it well. And like, those stories are so unhelpful and unhealthy, especially when you have one or two people who actually want to be experiencing, whether it's sexual intimacy or emotional intimacy or mental intimacy, whatever it is, where that's a priority for someone or both people. And so what I would encourage is, of course, looking at the reality of your situation and having realistic expectations about what it is that we can and can't do. But that we also need to open up that dialogue and have those conversations with each other often, right? How are we doing? I think a lot of times it gets put on this back burner, and then we sort of forget about it, and we never really look back to pull it forward to say, oh, this part of our lives just hasn't been, we haven't been depositing into this, this bank account for a really long time. And, when we get used to that, or that becomes our new norm, it's so easy for us to just leave it there. And so, I think we have a hard time communicating in general. It's a struggle for most couples who come into my practice are like, yeah, we want to work on communication. It's like, yes, I know. Everybody does. And so when we pair that with sex and intimacy, it's not a conversation that we always know how to have. And that's why it's so easy for it to get forgotten about, is that we don't know how to articulate our sexual needs. We don't know how to say, like, this is something that's really important to me, or I want to share an intimacy, or I'm craving you, or I'm missing this, this part of our lives. And so the encouragement is to keep talking about it, to check that story that tells you that like, it's over. If we're lucky, we're going to get to, we'll get around to it when we get around to it, because we need to be able to prioritize it in the same way that we prioritize all of the other things that are going on. And sure, at the beginning of, transitions, it might take, a slot further down the list, but to still be able to acknowledge it. Don't let it be forgotten. Bring it forward, even if you don't actually have the time to engage in something. Still name it. Still keep it on the front burner. Still keep talking about it, and think about ways in which the two of you can actually prioritize sex and intimacy and connection in that way. Sometimes the sex and sexual intimacy part is not at the top of the list, but generally what I tell couples is that you can carve out 5 to 10 minutes. I don't care what's going on in your life, whether you have a new baby or you can carve out 5 to 10 minutes of uninterrupted time. Of course, baby might interrupt it sometimes, but uninterrupted time where the devices at least are down, where there aren't other distractions, and where you are actually sharing in that space together, because we need connection, we crave it. So prioritizing that and making that something that's a non-negotiable can be really helpful.
That's so helpful. And yeah, just that thing of like continuing to talk about it, keep it in the loop. And yeah, 5 to 10 minutes is so reasonable.
Yeah.
And there's so much that can be done in 5 to 10 minutes in terms
so
of
much
connection and just presence with your lover.
Yeah. And sometimes I'm talking about it even though we're not going to do it. That's okay. And I'm talking about it and I'm not pressuring you, or we're talking about it and there isn't an expectation. Like, I think sometimes we have to name that. Sometimes we have this story that like, if we're talking about it, then it has to happen. And if it doesn't happen, then I'm going to let you down. And then we're going to have conflict. So we'd rather not talk about it. And like, that becomes this story that fuels it, as opposed to, hey, I know that we're not having sex tonight. Like, I know that this is not happening. And I still want to like hear how you're feeling. I still want us to be able to prioritize talking about this for a minute, or what, like to just name it and have it be in our mouths, so that it's not something that the other person or both people feel like is not being honored.
That's such a game changer. I mean, just to think of having conversations without expectations,
Yeah.
Without feeling like because we're talking about it, somebody needs to feel guilty or pressured.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I've had, I've heard many men actually say, oh, well, I just don't bring it up because I would never want you to feel pressured. Right. And so, but they'll bring it up in therapy because I'll ask them to. But it's, it's like, well, guess what? You can actually talk about it and there doesn't have to be pressure. Go, like, look at that, go figure. Like, if we just name these things and say, hey, there is no pressure, and I also still want to honor my experience, right? That just becomes such a beautiful gateway for deeper connection and deeper emotional intimacy, and even physical. Like, maybe you get to just lay next to each other or cuddle, and there isn't any expectation or pressure and frustration around that. So yeah, hopefully that's a good invitation for people to start to name the both. And I can both have my experience of this, and I can also create safety for us as a couple to, not take on expectations that we just can't hit right now, or pressure that makes either one of us feel badly.
Obviously, a couple have to sit down if they don't do this and kind of set new ground rules
Sure.
for how they're going to communicate. It's so fantastic. Thank you. So I'm curious about you, and it's always really inspiring to see somebody, where they're at now. And you mentioned before that you have a fiance now. Mm-hmm. He has a men's podcast, right?
So his podcast is called Man Talks, and but anybody can listen to it. It's more about him being a man talking. But he has considered having to shift it because I think a lot of people think it's only for men. That said, he does work primarily with men, which is so beautiful to see. I mean, the work that he does is so phenomenal. I have never seen a man work with men in the way that Connor does. He's really talented, and it's special, and it's an honor to both be his partner in this world and also just get to work alongside of him. Yeah.
So beautiful. And now you both have been collaborating and offering some retreats and
Yeah.
talks.
Yes. Yeah. We've been collaborating. We've been doing some events in New York together. We have a couples retreat that we're doing again in April, at the end of April. And it's the group work is so transformative. I actually get reminded every single time that I do group work how special it is. It's very different than, I mean, I literally see about 35 to 40 clients, individuals and couples and families each week, day in and day out. And I love that work, but there's something that's so different about group work, where you get to see yourself or you get to see your partner reflected in someone else. And when they're in the hot seat, your defense is down, right? You don't have to be protecting yourself, even though someone else is in some way doing very similar work as the work that you need to do. And it is just the most beautiful exchange of energy, and it is life-changing. It really is. So we're very excited to be doing that again in the Dominican Republic at the end of April. So we do have some spots left if anybody's listening and is interested.
Yeah, we'll have your link on our
Yeah,
podcast for sure. It always gives hope just to hear the journey of somebody, right? And I'd love to hear if you're willing to share some of your big shifts that you made in your own to be able to have the kind of love that is fulfilling for you.
Totally. So my parents got separated when I was in first grade. I was about 5 years old, and they went through a pretty long, grueling divorce, over about 9 years time. And I'm also an only child. So I, sort of as the witness to and the observer of a relationship dynamic, in its dysfunction, at the time. And also being an only child, I think to witness it and to be what felt like the one in the middle, because you sort of see your parents fighting over you, and you sort of get moved back and forth quite a bit. And you're also alone in that space. You don't have a sibling to share in that journey with you. And for me, back then, as a kid, you just, you don't want to create more disruption. I didn't want to create more disruption. Right? What I saw was a system that was burning down and kind of failing. And so for me, what happened was I just wanted to fly under the radar and do everything that I needed to do. I was constantly the person who was always fine, and really PC too. I want to make sure that both my parents are happy. I'm never going to say anything that's going to hurt either one of them, because they're hurt by each other and they're hurt by the system. And, kids are just so attuned and so aware and such little resilient human beings. It's incredible. But that was the position that I took. And I realized later on in life, and especially in my romantic relationships, that role was still a role that I was taking on, that I was always the partner who was okay. I was the girlfriend who was okay, always. Nothing really bothered me, even though that was untrue, right? I never voiced, there was not room for me to voice that I didn't like something or that something wasn't all right with me. And there not being any room was me choosing that, right? Not because anybody else was telling me that there wasn't room, but because that was the system that I had been a part of. It's how I knew how to exist in this world, and to exist without there being too much chaos, because I had a belief that if I needed anything, or if I felt strongly about anything, right, that would cause more drama, more chaos, more dysfunction. And so, big relational shifts, I think the biggest probably was recognizing that I needed to start honoring what it is that I felt and what it is that I needed, and that I didn't need to always be okay. That it was okay for me to not be okay, that it was okay for me to not like something, that it was okay for me to set a boundary, that it was okay for me to have a preference. That was probably the biggest shift, most monumental shaking of the system that happened. It changed everything. It changed everything, and it was so interesting because it's sort of like takes one time, and then you do it, and you're like, huh, okay, yeah, and like you do it, and it's all right. And I did it, and the relationship ended, and that was okay. I certainly had to grieve it, and it was sad, and it was hard, and it was emotional, and it was okay. And I did it, and I was like, oh, that wasn't that hard. Like, sure, the relationship ended, and it was probably going to anyway. But it was very eye-opening in that space to see that it wasn't so hard, and that once I had done it once, I was like, oh, I'm a pro. Like all of a sudden you're like, I want this, and no, I'm not okay with that, and no to that. And and so I haven't really looked back from there. And so that's definitely the biggest shift, and just to be able to connect it to the role that I played within my family system and how I was playing it in all of my romantic relationships as an adult, and seeing like, oh my goodness, I don't need to be in that disempowered place as that child anymore, right? It's like I can actually parent myself in this moment, right? And I often talk about our inner child, and where I think that the inner child has, different ages that can pop out at different times based on whatever the trauma or the wounding or the pain is, and how we need to be able to see our inner child, to pause and just see like, okay, what do you need right now? Because oftentimes they're kicking and screaming and punching from the inside to be like, pay attention to me. Be like, hello, I'm in here. And then when we actually slow down to connect, for me, I had to connect to her, right? I had to connect to her and see her and give little Vienna, what it is that she was craving. And once I did that, she was like, all right, like, I think I can maybe start to trust you as the adult to me, right? And then the more that I am consistent, and the more that she can trust me, the less disruptive she gets internally, right? Like, when I am in chaos, it is because I'm not listening, right? When I'm in chaos, it's because I'm not listening to her. And when I can start to connect and slow down and see her, and it doesn't mean that we change how somebody else is reacting, or even what the relationship is necessarily, but once I slow down and connect to her, then we're generally good. And then as the adult, I can actually take a step and be very purposeful and direct and intentional about what it is that we're doing. And then we become pretty grounded. So I hope that makes sense.
Well, it totally makes sense. Yeah. And it comes back to that whole listening thing of like actually
Yes.
taking time to listen, and kind of the really quick response of that. Like
That's right. Well, because we are so programmed to react, right? Like our threat responses, whether it's fight, freeze, or flee, we're so programmed, and it's like there's this anticipation or prediction of, we already know what's going to happen, and so this is how I'm going to protect myself. And to be able to slow down and to listen and see, okay, sometimes in the space of protection, not always, protection is good a lot of times, but sometimes in the place of protection, I'm actually contracting. I'm doing something that isn't getting me what it is that I need. And so to be able to just pause and take a moment to connect to that, to see, hey, maybe I don't need to freeze, flee, or fight right now. Maybe I can replace that with something else that actually allows me to expand instead of contract. Right. And so by pausing and practicing that, we can get pretty good at it.
I appreciate that. And I really like your language around connecting with our inner child. So our inner child trusts our adult version.
Yeah.
And I really put it in that way, but that makes a lot of sense. Like, how can we get this little being that we carry everywhere, to really value that we actually know better now.
It's such an empowering thought, because a lot of people have frustration when they're like, I can't change a parent, right? Or a parent isn't around anymore, whether they're just totally out of our lives or whether they're deceased, or and so there's something really empowering about becoming our own parent, right? About being able to heal those parts with ourselves. And yeah, it's beautiful when we can do that with the actual person. Like it is really lovely. And if we have access to that and you have a willing participant with someone, then that's great. And fear not, because if you don't have that, you can do it with yourself, and it can be so beautifully meaningful and just as healing as if that person were around or were willing to do that work. And so I just say that because I know a lot of times people just report how sad or disappointed or frustrated or angry that they are to not have someone who is willing or around or has the capacity to do it.
Thank you so much, Vienna.
Thanks so much for having me.